The initial combat encounters between the P-47 and Luftwaffe fighters only served to reinforce every assumption the Germans had made. The Thunderbolt's early operational combat radius was severely limited, barely reaching 125 miles from its base airfields, which drastically curtailed its usefulness as an escort for the heavy bomber formations that were beginning to penetrate deeper and deeper into German-controlled territory. Its rate of climb was distinctly inferior to that of German fighters, meaning that Luftwaffe pilots who had altitude advantage could usually maintain it throughout an engagement. In turning fights at medium altitudes, where much of the dogfighting took place, both the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the Bf-109 held clear and demonstrable advantages. The P-47 simply couldn't match their turn radius or their acceleration in these critical maneuvers. German fighter pilots, veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience, rapidly developed tactical approaches specifically designed to exploit these apparent weaknesses. They would attempt to force the heavy American fighter into protracted turning battles or into vertical maneuvering situations where the Thunderbolt's substantial weight became a significant liability rather than an asset. Everything the Germans observed in those early months of P-47 operations suggested their initial assessment had been accurate. What the Luftwaffe's technical experts and combat leaders fundamentally failed to grasp during this period was that they were essentially observing an aircraft that was still in its chrysalis stage, not yet fully evolved into what it would ultimately become. The transformation didn't begin with some grand strategic vision emanating from the Pentagon, or from some brilliant staff officer's master plan. Instead, it started with simple, pragmatic adaptation at the operational level, the kind of innovative thinking that often emerges when combat pilots and ground crews start experimenting with ways to make their equipment more effective. As 1943 progressed through summer and into autumn, P-47 pilots returning from their assigned bomber escort missions started engaging in what military parlance calls targets of opportunity. They would strafe railway locomotives sitting in marshalling yards, shoot up truck convoys moving along exposed roads, set fire to fuel storage depots. The results from these improvised attacks proved immediately and dramatically promising. The Thunderbolt mounted 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, each one capable of firing 800 rounds per minute when the trigger was depressed. Working in concert, these 8 weapons could deliver 12.7 pounds of lead-down range every single second, a storm of metal that could tear through a locomotive's boiler like tissue paper or shred an entire truck convoy in a matter of seconds. The destructive potential was obvious to everyone who witnessed it. The first official modifications to enable the P-47 to carry bombs came in November of 1943, when engineering teams installed bomb shackles rated for 500-pound bombs onto the belly centerline and wing pylons of production aircraft. On November 25th of that year, the 62nd Fighter Squadron conducted what the record books show as the first official P-47 bombing mission, when they attacked a Luftwaffe airfield at Saint-Omer in occupied France. 8 Thunderbolts, each one loaded with 2 250-pound general-purpose bombs, successfully obliterated 2 aircraft hangars and damaged 5 Luftwaffe aircraft that had been parked on the ground, demonstrating conclusively that the concept had genuine military value. This was no longer just strafing, this was the delivery of substantial explosive payloads against hardened targets, and it worked beautifully. The winter months of 1943 through early 1944 witnessed Republic Aviation and the United States Army Air Force's technical services dramatically accelerate the Thunderbolt's ongoing transformation from pure fighter to something entirely new. Engineering teams worked overtime to reinforce the wing spars so they could safely handle asymmetric loading situations that would occur when only one bomb dropped successfully or when ordnance hung up on one wing. They developed entirely new electrical systems, specifically designed to operate bomb release mechanisms reliably, whether the aircraft was at 30,000 feet in the thin, frigid air of high altitude, or skimming treetops at 200 feet, where the air was thick and warm. They created specialized gun sights, including the sophisticated K-14 computing gun sight, that could actually calculate proper bombing angles for both dive attacks and glide bombing approaches, taking into account airspeed, altitude, and dive angle to give the pilot an accurate aiming point. By the early months of 1944, the modifications being incorporated into production, Thunderbolts had progressed far beyond simply bolting on some racks to carry bombs. The M8 rocket, a 4.5-inch diameter unguided projectile, gave the P-47 striking power equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell, the same caliber used by medium field howitzers. Each rocket packed an explosive punch that could penetrate armor or demolish fortified positions. A single Thunderbolt could be configured to carry 10 of these rockets plus 2 1,000-pound bombs simultaneously, giving one single-seat fighter more explosive destructive power than many twin-engine medium bombers had carried in the early years of the war. The implications were staggering when you really stopped to think about them. One pilot in one aircraft with one engine could deliver more ordnance than had previously required a crew of 4 or 5 men in a dedicated bomber that was far more vulnerable to enemy defences and far more expensive to build and maintain. D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, marked the precise moment when the Luftwaffe fully comprehended and internalized exactly what the P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved into during those crucial months of development and refinement. On that single, monumentally important day, P-47 squadrons flew an astounding 1,985 individual sorties over the Normandy beachhead and the surrounding area. Those Thunderbolts dropped 525 tons of bombs and fired 135,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition at ground targets. The tally of destruction they achieved in just those few hours of daylight was almost incomprehensible. 86 locomotives destroyed, their boilers ruptured and frames twisted into scrap metal. 507 motor vehicles of all types reduced to burning wrecks. 38 artillery positions silenced, their guns knocked out, and their crews scattered or killed. 17 fuel dumps set ablaze, sending pillars of black smoke thousands of feet into the air. The aircraft that German intelligence had categorized and dismissed as a mediocre high-altitude interceptor, useful perhaps for defending bomber formations but not much else, had somehow become the absolute workhorse of tactical air power, the premier weapons system for providing close air support to ground forces and interdicting enemy supply lines. Everything the Germans thought they knew about the P-47 had been proven catastrophically wrong. Günther Röhrl, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot who survived the war with 275 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the highest-scoring aces in the entire history of aerial combat, encountered P-47 Thunderbolts repeatedly throughout the 1944 campaign. In an interview he gave to HistoryNet magazine in 1996, more than 50 years after the events he described, Röhrl recalled his experiences with remarkable clarity and candour. He stated that the P-47, which he noted had actually shot him down on one occasion, possessed capabilities that German fighters simply could not match in certain flight regimes. He and his fellow pilots recognized immediately that the Thunderbolt had tremendous diving speed, capable of reaching 1,400 km/h in a sustained dive, whereas the Bf-109 was strictly limited to approximately 1,000 km/h before structural failure became a serious risk. Röhrl learned this particular lesson very quickly when P-47s chased him, and he found there was absolutely nothing he could do to escape them once they committed to a diving attack from altitude. On May 12th of 1944, Röhrl was shot down by P-47s belonging to the 56th Fighter Group during combat operations over Germany. He lost his left thumb in the engagement when cannon shells ripped through his cockpit, and his damaged flying glove, stained with his own blood, is now on permanent display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington as a testament to that encounter. Following the war's conclusion, during the period when the Western Allies were studying captured German equipment and when former Luftwaffe personnel were being employed to evaluate Allied aircraft designs, Roll flew captured P-47 Thunderbolts at the German Fighter Leaders School for approximately 300 hours. This extensive flight time gave him intimate familiarity with the aircraft's handling characteristics and capabilities, allowing him to compare it directly with the German types he had flown throughout the war. His assessment, coming from one of Germany's most experienced and successful fighter pilots, carried tremendous weight. The P-47's unique ability to transform essentially instantly from a bomb-laden attack aircraft into a nimble air superiority fighter created an impossible tactical problem for Luftwaffe commanders trying to defend German-controlled territory. When German fighters were scrambled to intercept what appeared from ground radar and visual observation to be vulnerable fighter bombers laboring along with heavy external loads, they would arrive at the combat area only to discover that the Americans had simply jettisoned all their bombs and external fuel tanks the moment enemy fighters appeared. Suddenly, those supposed easy targets had reverted to being pure fighters with superior firepower, remarkable structural durability that could absorb tremendous battle damage, and diving speed that made escape impossible. German pilots found themselves in deadly combat with aircraft that had just moments before been carrying tons of ordnance, but were now completely unencumbered and fully capable of engaging in violent maneuvering combat. There was no good tactical solution to this problem. If you left the P-47s alone, they would destroy ground targets with impunity. If you sent fighters to intercept them, you risked those fighters being bounced by the American escort or being drawn into disadvantageous combat with Thunderbolts that had dropped their bombs. The raw statistics regarding the P-47's payload capacity created what amounted to a mathematical impossibility for German logistics planners trying to maintain supply lines and transportation networks. A standard production P-47D-25 variant could be configured with various bomb load combinations, depending on the specific mission requirements. It could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs on reinforced wing stations, or 3 500-pound bombs using both wing and centerline stations, or various combinations of bombs and rockets that could total 2,500 pounds of ordnance. This payload represented 62.5% of a B-17 Flying Fortress's typical operational bomb load of 4,000 pounds on long-range deep penetration missions into Germany. Hence the entirely reasonable approximation that a Thunderbolt could carry half of what a Flying Fortress carried, even though the fighter weighed less than a tenth of what the bomber weighed empty. When you started calculating what this meant at the squadron level, the numbers became even more impressive and more troubling for the Germans. A full squadron of 16 P-47s operating together could deliver 32,000 pounds of bombs in a single mission, which was equivalent to the bomb load that 8 B-17's would deliver operating at typical combat weights. But unlike the heavy bomber groups that flew from bases in England and could typically mount perhaps 2 missions per week due to the time required for maintenance, crew rest and aircraft repair, P-47 squadrons operating from forward airfields in France and later Germany itself could theoretically fly 3 complete missions every single day when weather permitted and when the tactical situation demanded such an operational tempo. This meant that a single P-47 fighter-bomber squadron could theoretically deliver more total tonnage of explosives in one day than an entire heavy bomber squadron could deliver over the course of an entire week. The efficiency differential was absolutely stark and undeniable when stated in such clear terms. Consider the manpower requirements as well. 1 P-47 Thunderbolt carrying 2 500-pound bombs required exactly 1 pilot and a minimal ground crew for refueling, rearming and basic maintenance, perhaps 6 or 8 enlisted men total. 1 B-17 Flying Fortress carrying 4,000 pounds of bombs into hostile territory required 10 aircrew members including pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator and 4 gunners, plus a much larger and more specialised ground support element to maintain the complex 4-engine bomber. The fighter bomber delivered very significant destructive power against tactical and operational targets, with literally a fraction of the manpower investment and training pipeline requirements. From a strategic resource allocation perspective, the advantages were overwhelming. Every pilot trained to fly heavy bombers represented hundreds of hours of expensive, specialized training. Every bomber lost meant 10 trained aircrew potentially killed or captured. The mathematics of attrition warfare clearly favored the single-seat fighter-bomber approach for many categories of targets, particularly those requiring precision attack or those located in areas with heavy anti-aircraft defenses where a nimble fighter could evade fire that would destroy a lumbering bomber. August of 1944 brought what was probably the most devastating and publicized demonstration of fighter-bomber effectiveness during the entire European campaign, and it occurred during the operation to close and reduce the Falaise pocket in Normandy. German forces trapped between the American and British-Canadian armies attempted to escape the encirclement through a narrow gap before it could be completely closed. From August 12th through August 21st, these retreating German units faced continuous, unrelenting attack from P-47 Thunderbolts operating in carefully coordinated shifts from dawn until dusk. The sky was never empty of Allied aircraft. As one squadron exhausted its ammunition and fuel and departed for base, another arrived fresh and fully loaded. The authenticated kill claims from the Falaise operation, which were later verified by ground reconnaissance teams that physically counted the destroyed vehicles and equipment, make for absolutely staggering reading. On August 13th alone, 112 tanks were confirmed destroyed, their hulls penetrated by rockets or blasted apart by direct bomb hits. August 14th saw 287 motor vehicles confirmed destroyed, everything from staff cars to cargo trucks to half-tracks. August 15th brought the destruction of 42 locomotives, each one representing critical transportation capacity that the Germans desperately needed. August 16th witnessed 89 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed, demonstrating just how far German logistics had deteriorated, that they were still heavily reliant on horse-drawn transport this late in the war. The 9th Air Force's P-47 groups operated on a carefully planned relay system, with fresh squadrons constantly arriving as others departed to rearm and refuel at forward airfields. This maintained absolutely constant pressure on any German forces that attempted any movement whatsoever during daylight hours. Movement meant death. Post-battle analysis conducted by Allied intelligence teams revealed that approximately one-third of all German vehicles destroyed in the Falaise pocket were victims of P-47 attacks specifically. The remainder fell to other Allied aircraft types and to ground forces, but the Thunderbolt's contribution was the largest single component. The 362nd Fighter Group pioneered systematic rocket attack techniques against German armoured vehicles, developing specialised tactics through trial and error and careful analysis of after-action reports. Their documented technique became standard operating procedure for rocket attacks across multiple fighter groups. The pilots would initiate their attack dive from 5,000 feet altitude, descending at a 30-degree angle toward the target. They would launch their rockets at approximately 1,500 feet altitude, which gave the projectiles enough flight time to stabilize and enough energy to penetrate armor at impact. Using this technique, experienced pilots could achieve direct hits on 30 to 40% of their launches, which was far higher than the accuracy rates achieved by artillery firing at similar-sized targets at comparable ranges. The fact that a single-seat fighter aircraft could deliver anti-armor fire with better accuracy than indirect artillery fire represented a fundamental shift in how ground combat could be supported from the air. The Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 demonstrated yet another dimension of the P-47's evolution, specifically its development into an all-weather fighter-bomber capable of operating in conditions that would ground most aircraft. The German offensive that month was launched during a period of absolutely miserable weather, with freezing fog, snow and heavy cloud cover that the German High Command hoped would neutralize Allied air superiority. For the first week of the offensive, weather conditions were indeed so poor that most Allied aircraft remained grounded, unable to locate targets or even navigate safely. But P-47 units equipped with British-developed rocket rails and improved instrument flying equipment continued operating whenever there was even marginal visibility. When the weather briefly cleared on December 23rd, creating the first good flying weather since the offensive began, P-47 squadrons launched 647 sorties in a single day, absolutely saturating the battle area with attacks. The pilots claimed over 400 vehicles destroyed in that one day of intensive operations, and ground forces later confirmed that the claims were not exaggerated. The cumulative statistics from the 5-day period between December 23rd and December 27th of 1944 reveal the scope of the P-47's impact on the battle. 201 German tanks confirmed destroyed, their crews killed or forced to abandon them. 1,930 motor vehicles destroyed, creating massive traffic jams that paralysed German movement on the limited road network. 953 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. 89 locomotives destroyed at railway stations and marshalling yards. 512 rail cars destroyed. 47 bridges damaged or completely destroyed, severing German supply lines. These losses were utterly catastrophic for the German forces attempting to sustain an offensive that was already overextended and desperately short of fuel and ammunition. The P-47s had effectively strangled the offensive by destroying its logistical tail. January of 1945 revealed yet another capability that the Thunderbolt had developed through operational experience and modification, specifically precision bridge destruction using heavy bombs. The 56th Fighter Group developed specialized techniques for destroying Rhine River bridges that had survived repeated heavy bomber attacks. The heavy bombers, flying at 20,000 feet or higher to avoid anti-aircraft fire, were extremely lucky if they could hit within 1,000 feet of their designated aim point. Bridge spans are narrow targets, and high-altitude level bombing simply lacked the precision to guarantee hits. But 8 P-47s diving at 60-degree angles could deliver their 1,000-pound bombs with 50-foot accuracy, which was more than sufficient to collapse bridge spans or crater approach roads. This precision came at a cost, with the dive-bombing runs exposing the fighters to intense anti-aircraft fire during the most vulnerable portion of their attack, but the results justified the risks taken. Bridges that had withstood dozens of heavy bomber raids fell to handfuls of P-47s piloted by men willing to press their attacks down to very low altitude before releasing their ordnance. The deployment of the Messerschmitt Me Tu-62 jet fighter in early 1945 should theoretically have changed the entire dynamic of the air war. With a speed advantage of more than 100 miles per hour over any Allied piston-engine fighter, the jets seemed immune to interception when flown properly. In level flight or in a climbing escape, they could simply outrun anything the Allies could put in the air. German pilots transitioning to the Me Tu-62 reported that it felt like cheating, like they were finally flying the fighter they should have had all along. But the P-47's evolution into a fighter bomber created an unexpected vulnerability for the revolutionary German jets. The Me Tu-62s required long concrete runways to operate safely, as their delicate engines couldn't tolerate the debris and irregularities of grass fields. They also consumed fuel at absolutely prodigious rates, giving them limited endurance and requiring frequent returns to base. This meant their bases became extremely high-value targets for Allied fighter bombers, and the jets were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing when their speed advantage meant nothing. On March 21st of 1945, P-47s belonging to the 365th Fighter Group caught multiple Me Tu-62s from Jagdgeschwader 7 during the takeoff phase at Leipheim Airfield. The jets, accelerating down the runway but not yet airborne or not yet fast enough to escape, couldn't maneuver or achieve the speed necessary to outrun the attacking Thunderbolts. 8. Me Tu-62s were destroyed in approximately 5 minutes of combat, which was more than the German aircraft industry could produce in an entire week given the disruption to manufacturing from Allied bombing and the shortage of critical materials and skilled labour. Attacking the jets on the ground or during the vulnerable takeoff and landing phases proved far more effective than trying to engage them in the air where their performance advantages were overwhelming. March of 1945 brought Operation Clarion, which involved the systematic destruction of the German transportation network by massed fighter-bomber attacks across the entire front. P-47 squadrons were assigned specific geographic sectors with orders to destroy absolutely anything that moved or could potentially move. Rolling stock, locomotives, trucks, cars, motorcycles, bicycles, horse-drawn wagons, anything and everything that could be used to transport supplies or personnel became a legitimate target. On March 22nd alone, the daily tally of destruction claimed by P-47 pilots included 89 locomotives destroyed, their boilers ruptured or their running gear wrecked beyond repair. 1,026 rail cars destroyed, blocking rail lines and destroying cargo. 155 motor vehicles destroyed. 17 bridges dropped into the rivers they had spanned. 93 rail cuts where the tracks themselves were severed by bomb craters. The cumulative effect of this transportation interdiction was to essentially paralyze German logistics across the entire Western Front. Units at the front couldn't be resupplied, reserves couldn't be moved to threatened sectors, wounded couldn't be evacuated. The German army's ability to function as a coherent military force simply collapsed under the weight of this sustained attack on its transportation network. The P-47's transformation from pure fighter to multi-role fighter bomber required continuous innovation and modification throughout its production run. The P-47 D-25 variant, introduced in mid-1944, featured reinforced wing structures stressed to handle 3,000 pounds of external load without risk of structural failure. It incorporated universal bomb shackles that could accept both British and American ordnance standards, which was important for operations from forward bases where ammunition supply could be mixed. Zero-length rocket launchers were developed that reduced aerodynamic drag compared to earlier rail-type launchers. Improved oil cooling systems were installed to enable extended low-altitude operations, where engine temperatures ran much higher than at the high altitudes the aircraft was originally designed for. Paddle blade propellers replaced the original narrow blade design, providing better acceleration and improved takeoff performance with heavy loads. Water injection systems were refined and standardized, allowing the R2800 engine to boost its power output to 2,800 horsepower for brief periods during critical phases of flight. The K-14 computing gun sight became standard equipment, giving pilots a sophisticated fire control system that could calculate proper lead for aerial gunnery and proper release points for bombing. Each of these modifications represented lessons learned in combat and rapidly incorporated into production aircraft. Republic Aviation's manufacturing plants at Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, demonstrated absolutely remarkable production flexibility throughout the war. Peak production reached 35 complete P-47s rolling off the assembly lines every single day, which represented an almost incomprehensible level of industrial output. 28 major variants of the basic P-47 design were produced during the war, each one incorporating different capabilities or improvements. 430 different field modification kits were developed and distributed to operational units, allowing aircraft already in service to be upgraded with new capabilities without returning them to the factory. Perhaps most remarkably, the factories maintained absolutely continuous production for 48 consecutive months without ever stopping the lines for major redesign work. This was a feat that no other fighter manufacturer managed to match during the entire war. Continuous improvement happened, but it happened incrementally without disrupting the steady flow of completed aircraft to operational units desperate for replacements and additional machines. Transforming P-47 pilots from pure fighter specialists into genuine multi-role combat aviators capable of performing a dozen different mission types required absolutely revolutionary approaches to training and pilot preparation. The United States Army Air Forces established comprehensive training programs that required an absolute minimum of 200 flight hours before a pilot could be certified combat-ready. This training included at least 50 practice bombing runs against ground targets to develop proficiency in dive bombing and glide bombing techniques. 20 rocket-firing passes to familiarize pilots with the ballistics and aiming requirements for rockets, 100 strafing runs to develop the skills needed for accurate low-altitude gunnery against ground targets, 40 hours of instrument flying to enable operations in poor weather and at night, 30 hours of formation flying to ensure pilots could operate effectively as part of coordinated squadron-level attacks. This comprehensive and thorough training regimen stood in absolutely stark contrast to the situation facing the Luftwaffe by late 1944. German pilot training had been systematically degraded by fuel shortages, by the loss of experienced instructors to combat attrition, and by the desperate need to rush partially trained pilots to operational units. By late 1944, Luftwaffe pilots were being sent to combat squadrons with as little as 110 total flight hours, and frequently with absolutely no training in fighter-bomber operations whatsoever. Fighter pilots were trained to fight other fighters, period. The American approach produced pilots who demonstrated genuine competence across a remarkable range of mission profiles, including high-altitude bomber escort, medium-altitude air combat, low-level navigation through defended airspace, dive bombing against pinpoint targets, skip bombing against bridges and ships, glide bombing for area targets, rocket firing against armored vehicles and fortifications, napalm delivery for area denial and anti-personnel effects, and ground strafing of soft targets. Individual pilots could transition seamlessly between these different roles as mission requirements changed, sometimes performing multiple different mission types on consecutive sorties in the same day. March of 1945 saw P-47 units pioneering the use of napalm for the first time in the European theatre. On March 11th, 8 P-47s, each carrying one napalm tank and one 500-pound conventional bomb, attacked a massive German supply dump near Koblenz that had been identified through aerial reconnaissance and intelligence reports. The napalm created an absolutely massive firestorm that was visible from more than 20 miles away, destroying approximately 3 acres of stored supplies in a matter of minutes. Ammunition exploded, fuel ignited, stored rations burned, and the entire depot was rendered completely useless. The psychological impact on German troops who witnessed such attacks was considerable, as napalm represented a weapon against which there was essentially no effective defense or protection. From March through May of 1945, the final 2 months of the war in Europe, the P-47 reached its absolute evolutionary peak in terms of both performance and tactical employment. The P-47M variant, designed specifically for high-speed interception, entered operational service with performance specifications that allowed it to match early jet fighters in level flight speed. It could reach 470 miles per hour under optimal conditions, which was within 20 miles per hour of the maximum speed achieved by early model Me-262s in level flight. The P-47N variant, originally designed for long-range operations in the Pacific Theatre, demonstrated a combat radius exceeding 2,350 miles while still carrying bombs, giving it intercontinental range when equipped with maximum fuel capacity. But beyond these impressive performance specifications, it was the tactical employment that truly demonstrated how completely the P-47 had revolutionized warfare. Individual Thunderbolts operated as forward air controllers, directing other attack aircraft to targets they had located. They served as artillery spotters for ground forces, reporting target coordinates and observing shell impacts. They flew photo reconnaissance missions, their cameras capturing damage assessment imagery and intelligence on enemy dispositions. They acted as communication relays, their radios linking ground units with higher headquarters when terrain blocked direct transmission. They served as psychological warfare platforms, dropping leaflets encouraging German soldiers to surrender. They made emergency supply deliveries to surrounded units, dropping ammunition and medical supplies with remarkable accuracy. The same basic aircraft type could perform 6 completely different mission categories in a single day, with individual aircraft transitioning between roles based on nothing more than a change in external ordnance and a different set of mission orders. This unprecedented versatility was exactly what American doctrine had been seeking. though few would have predicted in 1942 that the P-47 would be the airframe to achieve it. The comprehensive statistics covering total P-47 operations from first combat in April of 1943 through the end of the war in May of 1944-1945 define the scope and scale of this revolution in military aviation. Production totals are remarkable in themselves. 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts were built during the war, making it the most produced American fighter aircraft of the entire conflict, exceeding even the P-51 Mustang in total numbers. Republic's Farmingdale plant produced 9,086 aircraft. Republic's Evansville plant produced 6,242 aircraft. Curtiss Wright's Buffalo facility produced 354 aircraft before that contract was terminated. Peak daily production across all facilities reached 35 aircraft, an absolutely staggering rate of output. The unit cost of each P-47 actually decreased despite continuous improvements in capability, falling from $105,594 in 1942 to $83,001 by 1945. A reduction of 27% achieved through manufacturing efficiencies and economies of scale. Combat operations statistics are equally impressive. P-47 squadrons flew more than 746,000 individual sorties during the war. Combat losses totaled 3,499 aircraft, meaning aircraft lost to enemy action. Non-combat losses, meaning accidents and operational write-offs, totaled 1,723 aircraft. The loss rate per sortie was just 0.7%, which was remarkably low for an aircraft that spent so much time operating at low altitude in the face of intense ground fire. The air-to-air kill ratio was 4.6 to 1 in favour of the P-47, meaning that for every Thunderbolt lost in air combat, P-47 pilots shot down more than 4 enemy aircraft. These figures compare very favourably with other fighter types and demonstrate that despite its weight and size, the P-47 was entirely competitive in the air superiority role when properly flown. The ordnance delivery statistics are simply staggering in their scope. P-47 SS dropped 132,000 tons of bombs during the European campaign. They fired 135,000 rockets at ground targets. They expended 119 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, enough to fill an entire freight train with spent brass casings. The confirmed destruction tallies, verified through multiple sources including gun camera footage, ground reconnaissance, and intelligence reports, include numbers that are almost difficult to comprehend. In the air combat category, P-47s shot down 3,916 enemy aircraft. On the ground, they destroyed an additional 3,202 enemy aircraft caught at airfields or in parking areas. They destroyed 9,000 locomotives, each one representing critical transportation capacity that could never be adequately replaced. They destroyed 86,000 railway cars of all types, from boxcars to tank cars to passenger coaches. They destroyed 68,000 motor vehicles, everything from motorcycles to heavy trucks. They destroyed 6,000 armoured vehicles, including tanks, tank destroyers, and armoured personnel carriers. They destroyed 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles, demonstrating just how dependent the Wehrmacht remained on pre-industrial transportation methods. The cumulative total of confirmed ground targets destroyed exceeded 224,000 individual items, and this doesn't count the uncounted thousands of targets damaged but not completely destroyed, or targets attacked but not formally claimed due to insufficient confirmation. The P-47's evolution fundamentally changed military strategic thinking about air power and how it should be applied. Pre-war doctrine, which had been developed during the 1920s and 30s and was largely theoretical rather than based on actual combat experience, rigidly separated strategic air power from tactical air power as completely distinct categories requiring different aircraft types and different operational approaches. Heavy bombers were designated for strategic targets, meaning enemy industrial capacity, transportation hubs, and population centres. Fighters were assigned to achieve air superiority through aerial combat against enemy fighters. Attack aircraft, meaning specialized ground attack types, were developed for ground support missions assisting friendly forces. These three categories were treated as separate and largely non-overlapping spheres of activity. The P-47 simply merged all these roles into one airframe, achieving strategic effects through the cumulative application of tactical means. The systematic destruction of Germany's transportation infrastructure by P-47 fighter bombers accomplished what years of strategic bombing by heavy bombers had struggled and largely failed to achieve. By April of 1945, German forces simply could not move during daylight hours without suffering catastrophic losses. Supply lines ceased functioning entirely in forward areas. Reinforcements couldn't reach the front except through nighttime movement that was slow and extremely vulnerable to ambush. The tactical application of air power had achieved strategic paralysis of the enemy's entire military machine through sheer accumulated effect rather than through a few dramatic knockout blows against industrial targets. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which was conducted immediately after the war by teams of analysts and economists who studied the effects of the combined bomber offensive, reached conclusions that contradicted much of the pre-war theory about strategic bombing. Their detailed analysis revealed that fighter-bomber operations, conducted primarily by P-47 units and to a lesser extent by P-51 and P-38 units configured for ground attack, reduced German rail traffic by 75% in forward combat areas by March of 1945. This transportation paralysis contributed more directly to Germany's military defeat than did the destruction of industrial targets by heavy bombers, which was a shocking conclusion that called into question billions of dollars of investment in the strategic bombing campaign. The fighter bombers had won the war of attrition against German logistics and mobility, while the heavy bombers were still trying to knock out ball-bearing factories and synthetic oil plants. This realization would profoundly influence post-war air doctrine development. The P-47's revolutionary success forced fundamental changes in military doctrine that are still visible in how modern air forces are organized and equipped today. The United States Air Force's first independent doctrine manual, published in 1947 after the Air Force separated from the Army, stated explicitly that the artificial distinction between fighter and attack aircraft that had characterized pre-war thinking had been rendered completely obsolete by wartime experience. The manual declared that all fighters must be capable of ground attack missions and that all attack aircraft must be capable of self-defense against enemy fighters. This represented a complete reversal of the specialized aircraft philosophy that had dominated thinking before the war. The multi-role concept proved so revolutionary and so effective that it fundamentally shaped post-war aircraft design philosophy globally, not just in America, but in every major nation developing combat aircraft. When the Korean War began in June of 1950, just 5 years after the end of World War II, the direct descendants of the P-47 philosophy dominated tactical air warfare from the very first day. F-84 Thunderjets, which were essentially jet-powered successors to the Thunderbolt concept, and F-86 Sabres configured as fighter bombers rather than pure interceptors, provided the bulk of close air support and interdiction missions. Both types could engage enemy fighters when necessary, but spent most of their combat time attacking ground targets. The multi-role fighter concept that the P-47 had pioneered had become absolutely standard doctrine that nobody even questioned anymore. It was simply how fighters were expected to operate. Republic Aviation's transformation of the P-47 from its original interceptor concept into the ultimate fighter bomber represented American industrial capability operating at its absolute peak efficiency. The company's founder, Alexander Kartveli, had designed the aircraft with exceptional structural strength margins that far exceeded the original Army Air Force's specifications. The military requested an airframe capable of withstanding 6G loading in combat maneuvers. Kartveli built one stressed for 12G loading, double what was required. They wanted the capability to carry 500-pound bombs. He provided structure capable of safely handling 2,500 pounds, 5 times the requested capacity. This over-engineering, which might have seemed wasteful and excessive at the design stage, allowed field modifications that transformed the aircraft's capabilities far faster than formal design change processes could ever have achieved. The P-47s, leaving Republic's assembly plants in 1945, incorporated hundreds of improvements derived directly from combat experience and feedback from operational units. Yet production had never stopped even for a single day for major redesign work. Everything was done incrementally, with each improvement validated and then rolled into the production line seamlessly. The production statistics from Republic Aviation reveal the scope of the industrial miracle that made the P-47's success possible. 48 consecutive months of continuous production without interruption. 15,683 aircraft delivered to operational units. 28 major variants produced, each one tailored for specific operational requirements. 430 different field modification kits developed and distributed to allow in-service aircraft to be upgraded. Peak production rates reaching 35 complete aircraft every single day from 2 plants operating simultaneously. Unit costs reduced by 27% over the production run, despite the continuous addition of new capabilities and equipment that should have driven costs upward. These are the kinds of numbers that demonstrate what American industry could achieve when fully mobilized and focused on a clear objective. The P-47 fighter bomber concept directly influenced every subsequent American combat aircraft design in ways both obvious and subtle. The F-84 Thunderjet was explicitly developed as a jet-powered continuation of the P-47 concept, sharing the same basic mission profile and operational philosophy. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, which entered service in the 1970s, was named explicitly after the P-47 in recognition of the conceptual lineage, continuing the tradition of a durable, heavily armed aircraft optimized for close air support and battlefield interdiction. The F-105 Thunderchief was a supersonic strategic fighter bomber that extended the P-47's basic philosophy into the nuclear age. All 3 of these aircraft types trace their conceptual heritage directly back to the original Thunderbolt and the lessons learned from its operational employment. Beyond these direct descendants, the P-47 influenced countless other designs in more subtle ways. The F-4 Phantom II was designed from the outset with multi-role capability as a central design requirement rather than an afterthought. The F-16 Fighting Falcon, originally conceived as a lightweight pure fighter optimized for air combat, evolved into arguably the premier multi-role fighter bomber in the world by the 1980s and 90s. The F-15E Strike Eagle variant transformed the F-15 air superiority fighter into a devastating all-weather precision strike platform. All of these developments follow the template established by the P-47's transformation during World War II. The P-47 established training standards and operational procedures that are still followed today by modern air forces worldwide. Modern fighter pilots train extensively for air-to-air combat, air-to-ground attack in all its various forms, reconnaissance missions, and increasingly electronic warfare operations. This multi-role approach, with pilots expected to be competent across a wide spectrum of mission types rather than specialized in just one, was pioneered by P-47 squadrons during 1944 and 45. The 200-hour minimum pre-combat training requirement that the Army Air Forces established for P-47 pilots became the baseline standard for post-war fighter pilot training programs globally. The emphasis on instrument flying capability, on formation tactics, on weapons delivery accuracy, and on operational flexibility rather than rigid specialization all trace back to lessons learned from P-47 operations. American pilots finishing training today receive instruction that would be immediately recognizable to a P-47 pilot from 1944, even though the aircraft and weapons have changed beyond recognition. Hans Ulrich Rudel, the most decorated German serviceman of the entire war and history's most successful ground attack pilot flying the U-87 Stuka, wrote extensively in his post-war memoirs about encountering American fighters over the Eastern Front late in the war. He noted particularly that encounters with P-47s were distinctly different from encounters with other American fighter types. The Thunderbolts seemed more aggressive in ground attack, more willing to press attacks through heavy defensive fire, and notably more durable when hit by return fire. Rudell recounted multiple instances of seeing P-47s absorb damage that would have downed other aircraft types, but continuing to fly and fight effectively. He specifically praised the R-2800 engine for its reliability and its apparent immunity to oil leaks, noting that this stood in stark contrast to German aircraft, which suffered chronic problems with oil systems and engine reliability by that late stage of the war, when manufacturing quality had severely degraded. Statistical analysis of the air war over Europe supports the observations made by veterans on both sides. By the final months of the war, the Luftwaffe could muster only about 100 operational fighters on any given day across the entire Western Front. This wasn't primarily due to lack of aircraft, as German factories continued producing fighters right up until Allied armies physically overran the plants. The limiting factor was fuel availability, serviceable airfields that hadn't been destroyed or captured, and functioning logistics to supply ammunition and spare parts. All of these factors had been systematically destroyed primarily by fighter bomber operations. The P-47, along with other Allied fighter bombers, had achieved what strategic bombing alone couldn't accomplish, which was complete paralysis of enemy military operations through destruction of the supporting infrastructure. The economic efficiency provided by the P-47's fighter-bomber capability becomes even more apparent when you calculate the cost per ton of bombs delivered to target compared to traditional bomber operations. A B-17 Flying Fortress delivering bombs to a target deep in Germany cost approximately $28,000 per ton of ordnance delivered when you factored in fuel consumption, maintenance costs, and amortized aircraft cost. A B-24 Liberator was slightly more efficient at about $24,000 per ton delivered. A P-47 Thunderbolt attacking targets in the forward combat area cost approximately $4,200 per ton of ordnance delivered, making it roughly one-sixth the cost of heavy bomber operations. The crew loss rates told a similarly dramatic story. Heavy bombers lost approximately 8.5 aircrew members per 100 tons of bombs delivered to target when losses and tonnage were averaged across the entire campaign. P-47 operations lost approximately 9/10 of a pilot per 100 tons delivered, meaning 1/10 the casualty rate of bomber operations. The support requirements were equally dramatic. Delivering 1 ton of bombs via B-17 required approximately 47 ground personnel when you counted the specialized maintenance crews, armorers, and support staff needed to keep heavy bombers flying. Delivering that same ton via P-47 required approximately 8 ground personnel. The mathematics were absolutely undeniable and impossible to argue with. P-47's delivered destruction at roughly 15% of the cost and 10% of the manpower investment required for heavy bomber operations against comparable target sets. For tactical and operational targets within fighter range, there was simply no comparison in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. The transformation of the P-47 from a pure fighter optimized for high-altitude interception into a multi-role fighter bomber that could carry roughly half a B-17's operational bomb load represents far more than just tactical evolution or clever adaptation of existing equipment. It embodies what might be called American military genius for pragmatic adaptation and ruthless focus on what actually works rather than what theory says should work. The Luftwaffe never expected or anticipated this transformation precisely because it violated their entire understanding of how specialized military equipment should be designed and employed. German military doctrine, refined over centuries of Prussian and then German military thought, emphasized achieving perfection within narrowly defined roles. You designed the best possible fighter for air combat. You designed the best possible bomber for carrying bombs. You designed the best possible attack aircraft for ground support. Each type was optimized for its specific mission, and anything outside that mission was considered a wasteful distraction. American doctrine, shaped far more by industrial and engineering pragmatism than by military tradition, emphasized adaptability and efficiency above narrow optimization. The P-47 proved conclusively that in modern industrialized warfare, flexibility and versatility beat specialization almost every time. A good aircraft that could perform 6 different missions adequately was worth far more than a perfect aircraft that could only perform one mission superbly. When Luftwaffe pilots encountered P-47s over Eindhoven on that September morning in 1944, they weren't just facing an aircraft. They were confronting an entire revolution in military thinking that their own command structure had completely failed to anticipate or counter. Those heavy, clumsy interceptors they had dismissed and written off back in 1943 had transformed into the primary instruments of their own destruction. Not through achieving superior performance in any single category or role, but through unprecedented versatility that allowed them to be everywhere, doing everything all the time. The P-47 could escort bombers to Berlin in the morning, strafe a truck convoy at noon, bomb a bridge in the afternoon, and engage enemy fighters on the way home in the evening. No other aircraft in any air force could match that operational flexibility combined with that level of combat effectiveness. The P-47 Thunderbolt's combat record in the European theatre from 1943 through 1945 stands as one of the most successful in the entire history of military aviation, and the statistics bear this out conclusively. Maximum speed reached 433 miles per hour in the standard P-47D variant and an impressive 470 miles per hour in the specialized P-47M variant designed for high-speed interception. Combat radius extended to 450 miles when equipped with drop tanks, allowing deep penetration into enemy territory. Service ceiling reached 43,000 feet, higher than virtually any enemy aircraft could effectively operate. Maximum bomb load capacity was 2,500 pounds, equivalent to many dedicated light bombers. Production excellence was demonstrated through the total of 15,683 aircraft built, with monthly peak production reaching 1,050 aircraft across all production facilities. The unit cost was reduced by 27% over the entire production run, despite continuous improvements. 28 distinct variants were produced to meet different operational requirements, and more than 430 different field modification kits were developed and distributed to operational units. Combat effectiveness was proven through 746,000 total sorties flown, with a loss rate of just 0.7% per sortie. The kill ratio of 4.6 to 1 in air combat demonstrated the P-47's capability as a fighter. 132,000 tons of bombs dropped showed its effectiveness as a bomber. The destruction of more than 224,000 ground targets of all types demonstrated its revolutionary impact as a weapons system. The story of how the Luftwaffe never expected the P-47 to carry half a B-17’s bomb load illuminates a profound and important truth about military innovation and adaptation. The Germans, who were absolute masters of specialized technical excellence and who had pioneered so many aspects of modern warfare, failed completely to anticipate that the Americans would deliberately blur and eventually erase the traditional lines separating fighters from bombers. They couldn't imagine creating an aircraft that achieved excellence not through perfection in a single role, but through genuine competence across all possible roles. The P-47 Thunderbolt's evolution from a high-altitude interceptor that seemed mediocre at its designed mission into the most effective fighter bomber of the entire war didn't just surprise the Luftwaffe tactically. It revolutionized how air warfare would be conceived and conducted for the next 80 years and counting. Every modern combat aircraft flying combat missions today, whether American, European, Russian, or Chinese, incorporates fundamental lessons that were learned from the P-47's transformation during those critical years from 1943 to 45. The heavy fighter that couldn't outturn a Messerschmitt in a dogfight became the aircraft that genuinely helped turn the tide of the entire war through its adaptability and versatility rather than through raw performance. In the final analysis, that 7-ton fighter that German intelligence dismissed as too heavy and clumsy to matter in serious combat became the instrument of their military destruction, not through superior performance in any single measurable category, but through superior adaptation to the actual requirements of modern warfare. The P-47 proved beyond any possible doubt that in industrialized total war, the victor is not necessarily whoever flies the most specialized or technically perfect aircraft. The victor is whoever adapts fastest and most effectively to changing operational reality and who can deliver the most destruction to the enemies to fight, regardless of whether that destruction comes from air combat or from bombs dropped on supply lines. The Luftwaffe never expected P-47 Thunderbolts to carry half a B-17’s bomb load because such a capability violated every principle they held about proper aircraft design and employment. That failure of imagination, that inability to conceive that the rules they understood could be fundamentally rewritten, cost them air superiority, cost them operational mobility, and ultimately cost them the war itself. The P-47's transformation from fighter to fighter bomber represents the perfect example of how tactical adaptation, when applied systematically and at scale, can achieve strategic revolution, and how failure to recognize and counter that revolution can doom even the most professional and experienced military force to complete and devastating defeat. The Thunderbolt's legacy lives on in every multi-role fighter flying today, a testament to the revolution in military aviation that the Luftwaffe never saw coming until it was far too late to matter.